There is a particular quality to dust when it settles on stone. How it catches the light just so, like memory itself, soft and golden and somehow eternal. I find myself thinking of this as I run my fingers along the weathered walls of what was once the Colosseum's underground chambers, feeling the grooves worn smooth by countless hands, countless lives that pass through these shadows beneath the arena floor. Here, in these corridors that smell still of ancient sweat and fear and something indefinable, perhaps hope, perhaps desperation, I can almost hear the echoes. Not the roar of the crowd above, though that too lingers in the stone, but something quieter, more intimate. The sound of leather being tightened around wrists, the whispered prayers to gods, both Roman and foreign, the steady rhythm of breathing deep and measured as a man prepares to step into light that might be his last. This is where we begin our journey together, you and I, in the hushed darkness beneath spectacle, where the gladiator's true story lived, not in the grand gestures visible to 50,000 screaming Romans, but in the small human moments that no crowd would ever witness. Let me tell you about Marcus Aurelius Spartacus, not the famous rebel, but another man entirely, one whose name history forgot, but whose story I have pieced together from fragments, from the spaces between what was recorded and what was lived. He was a Thracian, captured in the borderlands where the Danube whispers secrets to the reeds, where morning mist rises like the ghosts of ancient battles. Picture him, if you will, on that last morning of his freedom. 23 years old, broad-shouldered from years of working his father's fields, hands calloused from the plough handle and the sword hilt both. For in those disputed lands, every farmer was also a warrior, and every harvest season might be interrupted by the thunder of Roman hooves. The morning was crystalline, the kind that makes you believe the world has been washed clean in the night. He had risen before dawn to check the grain that stood ready for harvest. The wheat moved in waves under an early breeze, golden and heavy with promise. His wife Livia still slept in their modest home, a structure his grandfather had built that he had hoped his own sons might someday inherit. But history, as it often does, had other plans. The Romans came as shadows, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with calculated precision. Auxiliary troops led by a centurion whose scarred face spoke of campaigns in Germania, in Gaul, in the endless territories that Rome devoured like a slow, methodical beast. Marcus heard them before he saw them, the soft clink of mail, the whisper of leather on leather. By then, it was too late to run, too late for anything but the bright flash of his father's sword in his hand, and the wild hope that he might take a few of them with him into whatever darkness awaited. The fight was brief, but fierce. Marcus was skilled, but skill means little when facing professional soldiers who fight with the weight of an empire behind them. When the iron chains clicked shut around his wrists, when he saw his village burning in the distance, something inside him died. But something else, something harder and more dangerous, was born in its place. The march to Rome took 37 days. Marcus would later scratch marks on his cell wall, counting backwards, remembering. 37 days of walking in chains, of sleeping on hard ground, of watching fellow captives fall by the wayside and learning not to turn when they cried out. He learned the rhythm of captivity during those days, the careful economy of energy, the way you must ration not just your strength, but your hope, your rage, your very humanity. He learned to eat the thin gruel without tasting it, to ignore the bite of iron against his ankles, to sleep despite the weeping around him. Most importantly, he learned to watch. to study the guards, their habits, their weaknesses, to memorize faces among his fellow captives, assessing who might fight and who had already surrendered to whatever fate awaited them. By the time the walls of Rome rose before them like a fever dream of marble and gold, Marcus had transformed. The farmer was gone, dissolved in the acid bath of enslavement. What remained was something more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and a growing understanding of what it meant to survive. The Gladiator school of Batiatus lay outside Rome proper, a compound that might have been mistaken for military barracks if not for the high walls topped with iron spikes and the watchtowers where guards kept constant vigil. This was the ludus, the school of death, where slaves were transformed into gladiators and gladiators learned to die with style. Marcus's first glimpse came through the narrow window of a prison cart, dust motes dancing in shafts of late afternoon sunlight as wheels rattled over cobblestones. The compound walls rose before them, limestone blocks fitted so precisely that no mortar showed between them. Roman engineering at its most pragmatic and imposing. The gates opened with a sound like thunder, and beyond lay a world that operated by its own laws, its own brutal logic. Here, life was measured not in years or seasons, but in fights survived, in wounds healed, in the fickle applause of crowds that might love you one day and howl for your blood the next. His cell was small, but not uncomfortable. A narrow room with stone walls, a straw mattress, a wooden bucket for water. A tiny window near the ceiling let in a square of sky that would become his calendar, his clock, his connection to the world beyond the walls. Later, he would spend hours studying that patch of blue, watching clouds pass like ships on an invisible ocean. The other gladiators he met were a catalogue of the empire's reach, Gauls with braided beards and tribal scars, Nubians whose dark skin gleamed like polished bronze, Germans so tall they had to duck through doorways, Syrians who spoke in musical accents of desert cities. Each had arrived by a different road of defeat and enslavement, but all had learned the same hard lessons of survival. There was Brutus the Gaul, who had been a chieftain before a Roman legion reduced his hill fort to ash. He fought with a massive two-handed sword and had survived 17 contests in the arena, each victory earning him small privileges, better food, a larger cell, the right to wear his hair in the traditional knots of his people. From these men and others, Marcus learned the unwritten laws of the ludus, how to keep your weapons sharp and your body clean, how to read the moods of the trainers and guards, knowing when to push forward and when to keep silent, how to preserve some small core of self in a place designed to strip away everything that made you human. But most importantly, he learned to fight. Training began before dawn each day, when the sky was still dark and the air carried the cool breath of night. Marcus would wake to the sound of a bronze bell, its tone cutting through the pre-dawn silence like the voice of an angry god. The training yard was a rectangle of sand surrounded by wooden posts and target dummies, some shaped like men, others like the wild beasts that gladiators might face in the arena. The sand was dark with old blood, renewed each morning but never truly clean, a reminder of what their training was ultimately meant to prepare them for. Marcus's first instructor was a retired gladiator named Hanno, a Carthaginian whose weathered face bore the scars of 20 years in the arena. Hanno had survived more contests than most men could count, and now he passed on his knowledge with the patience of a man who understood that each lesson might mean the difference between life and death. The crowd sees spectacle, Hanno would say, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. But we must think of craft. Every movement must have purpose. Every strike must be calculated. The difference between a gladiator and a warrior is that a warrior fights to win. A gladiator fights to survive. The distinction was crucial, and it took Marcus weeks to understand what Hanno meant. In his homeland, combat had been about victory, defeating your enemy as quickly as possible. But gladiatorial combat was theatre, a carefully choreographed dance between life and death that must satisfy not just the practical requirements of survival, but the aesthetic demands of entertainment. Marcus learned to move with his shield, the rectangular scutum that would become like an extension of his own body, made of layered wood and leather, bound with iron, and painted with the colors of the school. It was heavy enough to serve as a weapon in its own right, but required skill to wield effectively. The gladius, the short sword that gave gladiators their name, felt strange in his hand at first. It was nothing like the long blade he had carried as a free man, designed not for sweeping cuts, but for precise thrusts and close-quarters combat. Hanno taught him to think of it not as a weapon, but as a key, one that might unlock the door to another day of life if used with proper skill and timing. As the weeks passed, Marcus felt his body changing, adapting to the demands placed upon it. His shoulders broadened from wielding the heavy shield. His legs grew stronger from hours of footwork drills in the deep sand. His hands developed new calluses where the sword hilt rubbed, and old scars from his farming days were joined by fresh marks from training accidents. But the changes went deeper than mere muscle and sinew. Marcus found himself thinking differently, analyzing every situation in terms of advantage and vulnerability, threat and opportunity. When he watched other gladiators train, he automatically assessed their techniques, their weaknesses, their potential as allies or enemies. 6 months after his arrival, Batiatus summoned Marcus to his private quarters, a room that seemed to belong to a different world than the Spartan cells of the gladiators. Here were mosaics depicting famous gladiatorial contests, bronze sculptures of warriors in combat poses, and shelves lined with scrolls recording the victories and defeats of the school's fighters. "You progress well," Batiatus said, not looking up from the scroll he was reading. "Hanno speaks highly of your dedication, your natural ability with blade and shield. The municipal games are approaching. It would be an appropriate debut for someone of your potential." The words hung in the air like smoke from an altar, heavy with implication. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not fear exactly, but a deep recognition of what was being offered. His first taste of the arena, his first real test of everything he had learned. "You understand what this means?" Batiatus asked, finally meeting Marcus's eyes. "Once you step into the sand, there is no going back. You will be a gladiator in truth, not just in training." Marcus found his voice at last. "When?" Batiatus smiled. "1 month. You will fight as a Thraex, a Thracian gladiator, with curved sword and small shield. Fitting, given your origins." That night, Marcus lay on his straw mattress, staring up at his window where stars shone like distant campfires, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to kill another man for the entertainment of strangers. The thought should have horrified him, but instead he found himself analyzing it, breaking it down into components like a problem to be solved. This, he realized, was what the ludus had done to him. Not just trained his body to fight, but transformed his mind to accept the unacceptable, to find purpose in purposelessness, to create meaning from pure survival. The games of Magistrate Lucius Cornelius Maximus were modest by Roman standards, but for Marcus, they represented the crossing of a threshold from which there could be no return. The amphitheatre held nearly 8,000 spectators, their voices creating a susurrus of anticipation that seemed to rise from the very stones. Marcus had never seen the arena from the inside before this day. Nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming reality of the space itself, the tiers of seats rising like the sides of a vast bowl, filled with Roman citizens who had come to judge his performance with their lives as entertainment. His opponent was to be a Gaul named Vercingetorix, not the famous chieftain, but a younger man who had taken that name from pride or bravado. He fought in the style of a mumio, heavily armoured with a large shield and straight sword, his helmet shaped like a fish. Hanno had spent hours preparing Marcus for this specific pairing. The Thraex versus Mumio was a classic contest, pitting mobility against defence, curved blade against straight, the quick strikes of the Thracian style against the steady advance of the Mumillo. "Remember," Hanno whispered as he helped Marcus don his armour, "you are not fighting just this Gaul. You are fighting the crowd's expectations, their hunger for drama. Give them what they want, and they will love you." As the sun reached its zenith and the arena sand grew hot, the call came. Marcus felt the walk from the underground chambers to the arena floor, like stepping from one world into another. One moment he was in familiar darkness, surrounded by the comforting presence of fellow gladiators and trainers, and the next he was blinking in harsh Mediterranean sunlight as 8,000 voices crashed over him like a physical force. The noise was indescribable, not just loud, but layered, textured with individual shouts and conversations, the stamp of feet on wooden bleachers, the cry of vendors. Above it all was rhythmic chanting as the crowd called for blood, for spectacle, for the particular entertainment that could only be found when men fought for their lives. Marcus forced himself to look up at the tiers of seats that rose around the arena. The crowd was a cross-section of Roman society, senators in togas in the front rows, merchants and craftsmen filling the middle sections, slaves and freedmen packed into the upper tiers. But it was not the social stratification that struck him most forcefully. It was the simple, overwhelming reality of being stared at by so many people. Vercingetorix emerged from the opposite entrance as tradition demanded. He was everything Hanno had described, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of a man who had survived 3 previous contests. His armour gleamed in the sunlight, his shield bore fresh paint, and his helmet's fish crest bobbed with each step. They approached the centre of the arena and raised their weapons in formal salute. "Av, morituri te salutant," they called in unison. "Hail, those who are about to die salute you," though the words were directed not at each other, but at the crowd itself, the true arbiters of their fate. For a moment that felt like eternity. Neither man moved. They stood studying each other across the arena sand, each looking for some sign of weakness or advantage. The crowd held its breath. 8,000 people united in anticipation of the violence to come. Then Vercingetorix moved. The Gaul came forward with the measured pace of a professional, his shield held high, his gladius extended in a guard position. Marcus circled to his left, his smaller shield dancing in front of him, his curved seeker catching the sunlight as he sought an angle of attack. Their first exchange came when Marcus feinted left and then struck right, his curved blade seeking the gap between Vercingetorix's shield and shoulder armour. But the Gaul was ready, pivoting smoothly to take the strike on his shield, while his own gladius snaked out in a counter thrust that missed Marcus's ribs by inches. The crowd roared approval at this first taste of action, and both gladiators could feel the electricity of their excitement. Marcus pressed his attack, using his superior mobility to circle and strike from different angles, his seeker whistling through the air in combinations that would have overwhelmed a lesser opponent. It was Vercingetorix who drew first blood, his gladius finding a gap in Marcus's guard and scoring a shallow cut along the Thracian sword arm. The wound was minor, but the crowd exploded with excitement as a thin line of red appeared on Marcus's olive skin. Marcus knew he had to change his approach. Drawing on reserves of speed and precision, he launched an attack of such sudden intensity that Vercingetorix was caught off guard. His seeker moved in combinations that had never appeared in any training manual, strikes flowing seamlessly into the next with liquid grace. The end came with shocking suddenness. Marcus's spinning strike slipped beneath the rim of Vercingetorix's shield to find the gap between breastplate and shoulder armor. The curved blade punched through leather and flesh to scrape against bone, and the Gaul cried out as his weapon fell from nerveless fingers. The crowd's roar was deafening now, but underneath Marcus could hear individual voices calling for different outcomes. Some shouted, "Jugula, kill him," while others called "Mitte," spare him, arguing that Vercingetorix had fought bravely. The magistrate rose from his seat, and the crowd's noise gradually subsided. This was the moment that gave gladiatorial games their particular power. Not just the skill of combat, but the drama of life and death decided by the will of the people and their representatives. The magistrate extended his arm, thumb hidden within his closed fist, letting the tension build. Then, slowly, he turned his thumb upward, the signal for mercy. Marcus felt only relief as he stepped back and lowered his weapon. He had won his first gladiatorial combat, had proven himself worthy of continued investment, had survived to see another sunset. As he walked from the arena, the crowd's attention already turning to the next contest, Marcus felt the weight of what he had just experienced settling on his shoulders like a cloak. He had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, had become something new and dangerous. The farmer from Thrace was truly dead now, replaced by something harder and more pragmatic. A killer who could smile and wave at the very people who demanded his blood. But he was alive, and in the brutal calculus of the gladiatorial schools, that made him a success. Victory in the arena brought privileges Marcus had not expected. His cell was moved to a better location, his meals improved, and most importantly, victory brought respect from his fellow gladiators. The veterans who had previously ignored him now nodded when they passed in the corridors. Batiatus summoned him 3 days after his first contest, his manner notably warmer. "The crowd liked you," he said without preamble. "Your style, your presence. This is good. Gladiators who please the mob earn more appearances, and more appearances mean more opportunities for glory and profit." Training took on new intensity as Marcus prepared for increasingly dangerous opponents. Hanno pushed him harder than ever, focusing not just on technique, but on the psychological aspects of gladiatorial combat. Victory in the arena is not just about defeating your opponent, Hanno explained. It's about telling a story that the spectators want to hear. You must learn to make them love you, to turn them against your enemies, to survive even when you lose because the crowd demands your life be spared. This was a new dimension Marcus was only beginning to understand. A successful gladiator had to be part warrior, part actor, part politician, capable of reading and manipulating the emotions of thousands of strangers while fighting for his life. His second contest came against Cassius Maximus, a German with 7 victories to his name. The games were held in a larger amphitheater that could seat 15,000 spectators, and Marcus felt the weight of greater expectations as he prepared for his most challenging fight yet. The combat began slowly, each man testing the other's reflexes with careful probing attacks. Cassius fought exactly as Hanno had predicted, methodically, patiently, using his size and experience to control the distance while looking for decisive openings. But Marcus had been learning, absorbing lessons in showmanship that no amount of training could have taught. He began to vary his timing, to introduce irregularities into his attack patterns that disrupted Cassius's careful defenses. The curved blade of the seeker was harder to track than a straight sword, its path through the air following arcs that could deceive even experienced opponents. The decisive moment came when Cassius committed fully to what should have been a finishing thrust. Marcus stepped inside the attack, accepting a painful but non-fatal wound along his ribs in exchange for bringing his seeker across in a strike that caught Cassius beneath his sword arm. The curved blade punched through leather and muscle, and the German's weapon fell from nerveless fingers. The crowd exploded with appreciation for the skill and courage they had witnessed. This had been a contest worthy of their attention, a battle that would be remembered and discussed for months. The senator who was editing the games looked down at Cassius, assessing not just the man's wounds but his value as an entertainer, his potential for future contests. After a theatrical pause, he turned his thumb upward in the gesture of mercy. Marcus stepped back and saluted both his opponent and the crowd, acknowledging their judgment with the grace that successful gladiators learn to display. As he walked from the arena, the sound of cheers following him into the tunnels, Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him. He had learned to read and manipulate the crowd's emotions, had begun to understand the strange alchemy that transformed mere violence into entertainment. But success in the arena was like a drug. Each victory demanded a greater challenge, a more dangerous opponent. Marcus had taken his first steps down a path that led ultimately to only 2 destinations: legendary fame or violent death. 2 years and 15 victories later, Marcus faced the test that would define his legend. The emperor himself had taken interest in arranging a contest that would demonstrate Roman martial excellence to the civilized world. Marcus against the great Spartacus, the undefeated champion whose 37 victories had made him perhaps the most famous gladiator in the empire. The preparation was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. This was not just another contest, but a matter of imperial significance, with senators cancelling appointments to attend, and foreign dignitaries travelling from across the empire to witness what many believed would be the gladiatorial contest of the generation. Spartacus was everything his reputation suggested: massive, skilled, intelligent, and absolutely ruthless. He had survived 37 contests not through luck, but through a combination of physical perfection and tactical intelligence that had proved unbeatable for over a decade. He is just a man, Hanno reminded Marcus during their final training session. Skilled, experienced, dangerous, but mortal like any other. Fight your own fight, not his. Use your strengths, not his preferences. The contest itself was held in an amphitheater that seated 40,000 spectators, their voices creating a wall of sound that seemed to have physical weight. When Marcus and Spartacus entered the arena, the crowd's roar somehow managed to reach even greater intensity. For the first few moments, neither gladiator moved. They stood studying each other across pristine sand, each looking for some hint of weakness or advantage. The crowd held its breath, understanding that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Their combat began with explosive violence, both gladiators understanding that this contest would determine not just individual fate, but the direction of gladiatorial sport itself. Spartacus attacked with the fury and precision that had made him legendary, his gladius moving in patterns that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Marcus found himself driven backward, his shield ringing under impacts, barely managing to deflect the most dangerous thrusts. But as the exchange continued, he began to detect something unexpected. Spartacus was fighting cautiously, using superior technique to control the contest while minimizing risk. Drawing on reserves of courage he had not known he possessed, Marcus began to fight more recklessly, launching attacks that left him vulnerable, but created opportunities for spectacular strikes. One such attack succeeded. His spinning strike slipped past Spartacus's guard and scored a shallow cut along the champion's sword arm. The great Spartacus was bleeding. The crowd's reaction was explosive. 40,000 voices raised in appreciation of witnessing the impossible. The invincible champion had been marked. But the wound seemed to trigger something in Spartacus, some reserve of ability he had been holding back. His next attack came with fury that dwarfed everything before, seeking to end the contest before Marcus could surprise him again. Their shields came together with a crash audible throughout the amphitheater, and the gladiators were pressed together at close quarters, each straining for advantage. Marcus broke the clinch with a knee strike, but Spartacus's counter was immediate. His gladius punched forward in a thrust that would have pierced Marcus's heart if he had not thrown himself sideways. Instead of finding flesh, the blade caught in Marcus's armor, binding both weapons together. They stood locked, neither able to strike effectively, the crowd fallen silent as they witnessed the climax of the contest. Marcus found the solution using a technique Hanno had taught him years earlier. Instead of trying to free his weapon, he used the binding as leverage, pivoting to bring his shield's bronze boss up in a strike that caught Spartacus beneath his helmet's rim. The champion staggered, momentarily stunned, and Marcus pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. His seeker, finally freed, swept in a perfect arc that found the gap between breastplate and shoulder armor. The blade punched through leather and flesh to scrape against bone, and Spartacus cried out as his weapon fell from nerveless fingers. The silence in the amphitheater was absolute. 40,000 Romans sat stunned, trying to process what they had witnessed. The invincible Spartacus was down, wounded, his legendary career apparently at an end. Marcus stood over the fallen champion, his seeker poised but not threatening. Spartacus had propped himself up, and Marcus saw not fear in his eyes, but something that might have been relief. "Do it cleanly," Spartacus whispered. "You have earned the right, and I have no desire to live as anything less than what I was." The emperor rose slowly from his golden seat, the crowd's noise gradually subsiding as all eyes turned to him. For what seemed like eternity, he stood silent, then extended his arm. The thumb remained hidden for another long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned it downward. Marcus raised his seeker, aimed carefully, and drove the point home with surgical precision. Spartacus died instantly, his eyes losing focus as his body slumped forward. The crowd's roar when Marcus rose victorious was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had defeated Spartacus, had become the new champion, had earned his place in the violent mythology of Rome. As he walked from the arena through corridors lined with cheering Romans, Marcus understood that he had crossed a final threshold. He was no longer just a successful gladiator. He had become a legend himself, heir to Spartacus's legacy and reputation. Victory over Spartacus transformed Marcus in ways that went far beyond reputation. Within days, his name was being spoken with the greatest warriors of Roman history. But legend, he was learning, was a burden as much as blessing. His quarters became palatial, his privileges unprecedented, but with elevation came isolation. Other gladiators now treated him with awe and resentment that made normal conversation impossible. He was no longer one of them. He had transcended their shared condition to become something unique and untouchable. The pressure was suffocating. Marcus found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing through endless scenarios for his upcoming contests. The simple farmer who had once worried about weather and crops now carried the weight of an empire's expectations. His first contest as champion was against a massive Germanic tribesman named Commodus. The fight lasted barely 10 minutes. Marcus's superior technique allowed him to avoid his opponent's attacks while systematically dismantling his defenses. When the end came, it was swift and decisive. But the crowd's reaction was somehow muted. They had expected something more challenging, and instead witnessed what amounted to an execution. Marcus realized his victory had created a new problem. He was now so skilled that ordinary opponents could not provide the spectacle Roman audiences demanded. Success had isolated him from his peers, burdened him with impossible expectations, and trapped him in a cycle of ever-increasing risk that could only end in defeat or death. But he was committed now, bound to his legend, as surely as any slave was bound to his master. 2 years and 23 victories later, Marcus faced his ultimate challenge, not one opponent, but 3 in succession, something that had never been attempted at the highest levels of gladiatorial combat. The contest was scheduled for the New Year's Games, with the emperor declaring a public holiday, so all citizens could witness the unprecedented spectacle. The morning dawned with ominous beauty, the sky painted crimson and gold. 50,000 Romans packed the amphitheater, their collective voice creating sound that seemed to have physical weight. His 3 opponents represented comprehensive tests of every aspect of gladiatorial combat. Brutus the Gaul, with his traditional strength and technique, Cassius of Alexandria, Retiarius, whose speed and unorthodox tactics would force complete adaptation of strategy, and finally, Lucius Maximus, a young gladiator whose natural talent and aggressive style represented everything Marcus had once been, but with the advantage of youth. As Marcus entered the arena, the crowd's noise reached levels that seemed to violate natural law. He had achieved the impossible once by defeating Spartacus. Now, he would attempt something that no gladiator in history had ever accomplished. The first contest began with explosive violence. Brutus came forward with veteran's confidence, but Marcus was ready. Drawing on reserves of speed and precision never fully utilized before, he launched attacks of such intensity that Brutus was caught completely off guard. His seeker moved in combinations that transformed violence into artistry, and the end came with shocking suddenness. Marcus's blade finding the gap between helmet and shoulder guard. Cassius of Alexandria entered as Brutus's body was removed, the Retiarius moving with fluid grace that had made him famous. Their battle became a complex dance of advance and retreat, Marcus testing himself against an opponent whose style required complete tactical adaptation. The decisive moment came when Cassius attempted his most dangerous technique. Marcus stepped into the net, accepting entanglement to close with his opponent, while Cassius was committed to his attack. His seeker punched upward through minimal armor, finding the heart with surgical precision. 2 opponents defeated, but the most dangerous remained. Lucius Maximus entered with the youth's confident stride, representing everything Marcus had once been: young, hungry, possessed of talent not yet fully tested. They faced each other across blood-stained sand, veteran and newcomer, legend and aspiring legend. Their combat began with explosive violence. Both understanding this final contest would determine not just a victory, but the very meaning of courage and skill in Roman understanding. Marcus felt fatigue beginning to slow his reflexes, could sense his body's protest at unprecedented demands. But skill and experience had their own power, and he drew upon reserves of knowledge accumulated through hundreds of hours of training. The end came suddenly. Maximus, pressing what he believed was decisive advantage, overextended slightly on a thrust. Marcus, fighting on pure instinct, saw the opening and took it without conscious thought. His seeker swept in perfect arc, finding the gap between breastplate and shoulder armor that every gladiator knew existed, but few could exploit under combat conditions. The silence in the amphitheater was absolute before shattering like breaking glass. 50,000 voices rose in appreciation of something approaching divine favor. One man had defeated 3 opponents in succession, had accomplished something that would be remembered for generations. Marcus had achieved the impossible, had proven himself worthy of a place among the greatest heroes of Roman mythology. But as he walked from the arena, he felt something profound shift in his understanding. He had reached the absolute pinnacle of his profession. There was nowhere left to climb, no greater challenges to face. In the months that followed, Marcus found himself living between mortality and myth. Poets competed to compose verses about his triumph. Artists created mosaics capturing his victories. Philosophers debated whether his achievement transcended humanity entirely. But ultimate success brought its own captivity. He was now a symbol of Roman excellence, a living representation that could never show weakness or ordinary human frailty. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every word analyzed for hints about his thoughts on combat and heroism. He began declining contests, accepting only ceremonial appearances that carried minimal risk to his reputation. Each fight would be measured against his defeat of 3 opponents, each victory seeming anticlimactic. And each carried the possibility of defeat, which would not just end his life but destroy the myth that had grown around his name. As seasons passed, Marcus found himself increasingly isolated from active gladiatorial combat. Younger fighters rose to prominence, new legends began forming, and the sport evolved in ways that made his fighting style seem almost archaic, despite its proven effectiveness. It was during this period that he began contemplating something that would have seemed impossible during his active career: retirement. His wealth was sufficient to support him indefinitely. His status protected him from normal legal constraints, and his fame provided opportunities few Romans could hope to enjoy. When freedom finally came through imperial manumission, Marcus discovered that legal freedom did not bring psychological liberation. He remained bound to his legend as surely as he had ever been bound to his lanista. He used his wealth to establish a school for young gladiators, passing on knowledge that had made him legendary. But even in this role, he found himself trapped by expectations. Every student measured against his example, every lesson filtered through mythology surrounding his name. Years passed, and Marcus aged with quiet dignity. His hair turned grey, his face gained new lines, his body showed accumulated wear of decades spent perfecting the art of violence. But his eyes remained clear, and his presence still commanded respect. He never fought again after his victory over 3 opponents, understanding that nothing could ever match that moment of transcendence. Instead, he became something rarer than a successful gladiator, a legend who had chosen his own ending, who had stepped away from combat while still at the height of his powers. When death finally came, it was from simple passage of time rather than wounds received in battle. Marcus died peacefully in his villa, surrounded by students and admirers gathered to witness the passing of perhaps the greatest gladiator who had ever lived. But even in death, his legend continued growing. His techniques were studied and emulated, his contests analyzed and debated, his story told and retold until it became part of Rome's permanent mythology. Children who had never seen gladiatorial combat knew his name. Poets composed verses about his battles. Philosophers used his life as an example of human potential. Marcus had achieved what every gladiator dreamed of. He had become immortal, not through divine intervention, but through human memory and the stories we tell about greatness. His transformation from captured farmer to legendary champion represented the Roman belief that greatness could emerge from unlikely circumstances, that courage and skill could elevate any person beyond the limitations of birth. In the end, Marcus had found what he had been seeking from his first day in the ludus, not just survival or success, but meaning itself. He had transformed the brutal transaction of gladiatorial combat into something approaching art, had found purpose in purposelessness, had created beauty from violence and legend from mortality. The arena sand had long since been swept clean. The amphitheaters where he fought had crumbled into ruins, and the empire that celebrated his victories had itself become memory. But the story endured, passed down through generations who understood they had once witnessed something extraordinary. A man who had transcended normal boundaries of human achievement to become something approaching eternal. Marcus Aurelius Spartacus, the Thracian farmer who became the greatest gladiator who ever lived, had achieved the only immortality available to mortals. He had become a story worth telling, a legend worth preserving, a memory worth keeping alive long after the last witness to his greatness had joined him in whatever realm awaits those who live and die with honor. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.